My World War II story begins with the surprise bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese on December 7 in 1941. I was at that time a senior attending the University of Washington. Upon hearing the news of the bombing, I immediately joined the U.S. Navy and requested service in the Supply Corps. First, the Navy sent me to their Navy Supply School, which is located at the Harvard Graduate School of Business Administration in the city of Boston. After 6 months at Harvard, I reported to the Commander of Destroyers Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. At Pearl Harbor, from November 1942 to January 1943, I trained on various ships, including the USS Smith, the USS Aaron Ward, and other various ships, while I was at that time awaiting the arrival of the USS STRONG, DD-467, that was in the South Pacific at that time. In January 1943, I was transported to the USS Aaron Ward to where the USS Strong was anchored at Segond, S-E-G-O-N-D, channel in Espiritu Santo Island in the New Hebrides. I had to board the Strong because it was moored between several ships by climbing up over the fantail without a ladder. I presented my orders to the captain, Commander Joseph H. Wellings, and met with the ship's executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Frederick Purdy, who informed me that the ship's crew had not been paid for some time and that the ship was out of toilet paper. Acting on a tip from a crew member, I used what is called cumshaw in Navy terminology to find a supply of toilet paper which was stashed in a hidden warehouse up a nearby river. Apparently they were holding it for ransom or something. I commandeered a whaleboat with some helpers. We proceeded up the river under cover of darkness to fill the whaleboat with all the toilet paper it could hold. The next morning, tired from being up all night and very hungry at breakfast, I was presented with a plate of fresh-baked hot cross buns by the very grateful ship's baker. My ship, the USS Strong, was part of Admiral Halsey's battle group, commanded by Joseph H. Wellings, commanding the ship, that is. He had assumed command of the USS Strong in August of 1942. The purpose of the Halsey's group was to go in to bombard the Japanese shore batteries and ammunition dumps in the New Georgia area on various islands. The purpose of going into New Georgia at this time was because Guadalcanal had been captured and was safely in American hands, and the control of that part of the Solomon Islands was now assured by the Americans. Our purpose now was to take them on the mission of capturing New Georgia. And as we were going in night after night to among the islands of New Georgia to bombard the shore batteries and ammunition dumps on these various islands, night after night, we manned our battle stations, staring into the darkness, searching for objects on the dark sea. Tension and nerves taut, hour after hour, sometimes with no sleep. It was estimated there were approximately 5,000 Japanese military personnel, soldiers and others, on the island of Kula, all very mad at the United States personnel, and particularly at the USS Strong, for giving them, quote, hell for months from July to July, where we are at the time of this writing. On July 4th, 1943, while folks back home were going to 4th of July picnics and parades, I began a routine day on the ship of going to my departmental area to work as decoding messages came in to the decoding room, which included reports of the previous day's battle actions and bringing the crew payroll records up to date. Preparations to get underway for that night's patrol began at 15 hours under naval time. As assistant gunnery officer in charge of 420mm anti-aircraft guns and their crews, I personally made a check of my battle stations, make certain that each gun captain had his quota of ammunition and that my life-saving gear and helmet were in their proper place. At approximately 2300 hours, the captain issued an order for all hands to man battle stations. We continued sailing toward our destination, which was a point where we would commence to fire at the targets chosen for that evening, which in this case, the targets were Japanese military emplacements, coast artillery guns, supply dumps, ammunition dumps, and other critical facilities to the Imperial Japanese Navy on Kula Island. At the same time, Marines were being transported assault ships to assist on land in the capture of New Georgia. After less than 30 minutes of firing, the captain ordered ceasefire, and we were to, quote, get the hell out of there. The Strong had just started her turn when I heard Gunnery Officer Al Curran yell, "Torpedo!" Before he could pronounce the O in torpedo, I heard and felt a terrific blast which threw me against a bulkhead. My first thought was to get to the 20mm guns, but immediately the water was rising up past my ankles to my knees. Rapidly, I knew my first day of duty was to go to my office and rescue the pay records that I had prepared that day. Therefore, I ran through the water to my office a few feet away, grabbed the records off my desk, rolled them up, stuffed them into a condom, and tied it at the end so it was watertight, and put the package in my shirt pocket. From the time the torpedo struck, I could hear men yelling and screaming from in the water off the stern of the ship. After leaving my office, I went over to the side of the ship, looked down and saw men in the water, one man with his head half submerged from the weight of his helmet, who appeared to be drowning. I stepped off the ship into the water to see if I could help him. I took off his helmet, discovered that he had no life-preserving equipment on him. Therefore, I took off my extra life belt, put it around him, inflated it, and straightened him out until he stopped yelling. There was a group of maybe half a dozen or so men in the water nearby, so I went to the next man. I recognized him as Sisson, S-I-S-S-O-N, a commissary man in my division. He was obviously in great pain and without any life-preserving equipment. I took the life belt of a nearby man who had both jacket and belt and put the belt on Sisson. I asked Sisson where he hurt, to which he replied, "My leg is broken." I told him I could give him some morphine, and he said, "No, I want to be in control of what happens to me." Over the years, I often wondered if he had made it. I learned later that he had perished and not made it, and was not rescued. Over the years, that happened to several that I had inquired about. It appeared that there were no others who needed immediate help. Several of us began a discussion of what we'd do next from where we were at that time. There were a number of men in the same position, drifting away from the ship. We were moving away from the ship because of a rapid current that flew past the ship as it sank lower into the water. Suddenly, we heard a loud crash. We learned later that the crash was caused by the destroyer Chevalier, Chevalier, that deliberately crashed into the hull of the Strong to try to keep it from sinking so rapidly. That maneuver worked properly. It did hold and support the Strong sufficiently enough time that some 240 crew members were able to get from the Strong over onto the Chevalier by crossing on ropes which had been tossed over to the Strong after the Chevalier had jammed its bow into the hull of Strong. Meantime, arguments among the men continued, which were more or less all the same nature, shouting back and forth to each other over what to do next and in which direction to swim at this time. Because the Strong had been torn apart in the center, actually the keel had been broken, and it continued to break apart. At one point, we heard the ship's motor whaleboat, which seemed to be moving away from the ship. I wondered if they had come to pick us up, but the sound continued as if they were moving away, and we had to decide for ourselves what to do. I noted that from the sound of the whaleboat, it was moving toward the exit of Kula Gulf, where we were now located on the sea in the inlet at Kula Gulf. I felt that the direction we need to swim in order to find rescue ships would be in the same direction as the motor whaleboat had left, which would be to the mouth of Kula Gulf, against the current. I also knew that there was a danger of the ship's depth charges exploding underwater. After swimming a distance, sure enough, the ship blew up beneath us. I heard the terrific roar of the depth charges, and it felt like a 100-pound bag of cement had hit me in the stomach. There were still some men trying to decide which way to swim as the ship was sinking. At that time, the Japanese were still shelling the sinking Strong. First, they fired star shells in the air to light up the area like fireworks. At the same time, from the lighting up of the area, it confirmed to me in which direction the artillery of the Japanese was located and where we should swim as the ship was sinking. Although it was pitch dark, I was thankful that there were no waves to fight, that the water was warm, and there was a current flowing from the mouth of Kula Gulf southward to the islands where the Jap troops were stationed. We knew that Admiral Ainsworth would direct ships to search for survivors in the area where the Strong went down. We swam hard against the current to keep from ending up on the beaches of those islands where our fate would be in the hands of the enemy, where we surely would have died along with the other many survivors who ended up on the beaches and were not rescued. Out of the group of 5 or 6 men who stayed with me, machinist mate First Class Melvin Dubard, D-U-B-A-R-D, and Seaman Eddie Rock, I urged them to keep up, as they knew time was of the essence, and we had to indeed swim for our lives if we were to have any chance of being rescued. I had decided when I first stepped off the sinking ship that I was going to swim with my boots on, which was possible wearing a life vest, in case I landed on a beach. I remembered reading stories about other men abandoning ship who, once they got to shore, found it impossible to walk barefoot on the sharp coral beaches. At one point, after a couple of hours in the water, my life vest getting waterlogged, I had to choose between keeping my waterlogged boots on or dumping them to make my long swim easier. I had to decide to let the boots go. I had often seen sharks in the water. I had read about a yellow-bellied sea serpent, more venomous than the king cobra. Fortunately, we did not encounter either of these species along the way. Perhaps the battle sounds, explosions of the depth charges, and the sounds of the ship breaking apart kept these creatures away from the area. I could smell oil on the water, leaking now from the sunken ship, and while it burned my eyes, I did not let it impede my swimming. After several hours in the water, which seemed like an eternity, we came upon a float net with 2 apparently unconscious men laying on it. As I got closer and could see clearly, I could see that it was Captain Wellings, the captain of the Strong, and his signalman First Class Rodriguez. As we slid onto the front net, Rodriguez came to, and Captain Wellings stirred and said, "Who is there?" I replied, "It's Ensign Sherlie with 2 shipmates. Are we glad we found you?" Captain Wellings was now in charge of the group, instructed us to just lay there quietly because help was surely coming. There was room for the 5 of us on the floating net, enough to lift us out of the water so we could finally rest without sinking. After what seemed like an interminable time, Dubard and I at the same time said very quietly, "There is something coming." We could barely discern an object through the darkness in the distance on the surface of the ocean. As I was thinking exactly the same thing, one of the men very quietly said, "Is it one of ours?" I woke up Captain Wellings and told him there was something approaching. I was wondering if it might be a Jap submarine or an armed motor launch. As we all knew, the Japanese like to hunt for swimmers and shoot them in the water. Rodriguez said, "We need to give a signal for the night." Rodriguez was told we need to give a signal for the night. Rodriguez then replied, "I need a light." We all looked at each other. Then Dubard handed Rodriguez his flashlight. Melvin Dubard thank God, was the only survivor among all of us who had a flashlight. When the captain said, "Go ahead," Rodriguez signaled the letter K, which was the code for that day. A voice called out across the water, "We see you. Put out that damn light." I was thankful and excited to hear that it was an American voice. When the rescue ship maneuvered close to the float net, crew members of the ship threw lines over the side. Rock and I moved Captain Wellings off to the side of the ship so he could be able to grasp a line to be brought aboard. Then Rock, Dubard, and I lifted Wellings as far as we could, while men on the ship reached over to grasp and pull him over the side of the ship aboard the ship. It was obvious to us then that the captain was badly hurt. He cried out in pain as he went up and over the side. The rest of us, left to our own, grabbed a line and followed up over the side of the ship. The first man I saw as I stood on the deck was Miles Doan, D-O-A-N, a former Harvard classmate. Delighted to see him, I yelled, "Miles, boy, it is good to see you." He stared at me with a puzzled look because I was unrecognizable, covered with black oil from head to toe, bloody nose, bloody mouth, missing teeth. A crew member escorted me down some steps to a shower room, handing me some soap and clean towels. I said to him, "Who are you guys?" He replied, "The Gwin, Gwin, meaning the USS Gwin." I stepped under the hot shower and began scrubbing the smelly black oil off my body, starting with my hair. Halfway through the shower, butt naked, with no clothes, shoes, or weapon, I heard and felt the Gwin's cannons firing. I thought, holy shit, here we go again. This was the only moment during this entire escapade that I felt apprehension and when real fear gripped my guts. A fear that we were starting all over again. Right then, a member of the crew member brought me clean pants, a shirt, and handed me a cup of coffee. I asked him what was going on. He said a Jap shore battery spotted us, started shooting at us, and we were firing back. He told me that the ship was turning now so we could get the hell out of there. I thank the good Lord that because the Navy looked out for its own, the Gwin had searched for us in the dark, and my shipmates and I were saved. I thank God, too, that had Melvin Dubard, truly a first-class machinist mate among us, who was the only one prepared with a working flashlight enabling Rodriguez to signal the Gwin. Because Dubard was so well prepared, Wellings and Rodriguez, both severely injured, it was learned later, were able to get the immediate medical attention that they so badly needed from the medical officer on the Gwin. When we were on the float net, it was obvious to me how very serious Captain Wellings' injuries were, and I remember becoming more and more concerned about him with the passing of time. I want to mention here that in 2003, at age 87, I had an opportunity to attend the USS Strong reunion in North Carolina. There were only 10 living survivors of the USS Strong living at that time, of which I was one, and yes, Melvin Dubard the machinist on the float net with me who had the flashlight that saved my life, and that of Captain Wellings. When Dubard heard that I was coming to the reunion, he and had his family take him out of a hospital where he was suffering from a stroke to drive him to the reunion. As you can imagine, Dubard was very glad, and Dubard and I were very glad to see each other after 50 years, and we had a very emotional reunion. Unfortunately, Dubard died 1 year later in 2004. I must have slept through an entire day, for it was dark again when the Gwen DD-433 reached the landing at Honiara, Guadalcanal. Captain Wellings and I were moved off the ship into an ambulance. I lost track of Rodriguez and Dubard after this time. The transport was most painful for Captain Wellings because the road to the Mobile Operating Base No. 5 hospital was a rough one. I could hear the captain moan in pain after he felt a bump. Once at the hospital, I was put with Commander Wellings in the same ward. I felt very honored that I was, as a lieutenant, I was lowest ranking officer. The next morning, a doctor and his nurse examined me. They told me it's okay for me to walk about, be as active as possible, but to take it a bit easy. Days later, I read my medical report, which indicated that even though I had been in the water 4 to 5 hours, my body condition was as if I had merely floated in a quiet pod. Later that day, the nurse told me that Captain Wellings wanted to talk to me. My first words out of his mouth when I walked up to the hospital bed were, "Isn't this a great Navy?" His words made me feel positive and assured again. He told me to report in to Admiral Halsey's office on his behalf as soon as I could, and to advise the Admiral that the strong survivors who were physically ready should go back to the United States as the Strong Ships Company for survivors' leave. There should be an insert at this point that we didn't get here. Actually, at that moment, Admiral Halsey was no longer in charge of that section of the war area. He had been removed by Douglas MacArthur, the general. He took Halsey out of that spot, moved him off to where he was in charge of all the ocean areas, but none of the land areas. And a general by the name of Millard F. Harmon, Harmon. I've never checked to see if he's located to the Snohomish Harmons that used to be here. But General Harmon was a very helpful individual, very friendly, as kind as could be when I was looking for help. He later became famous for designing General MacArthur's famous skip to the islands, move the islands, the war faster. And MacArthur took credit for all the work that was done by General Harmon. Unfortunately, General Harmon was lost a month or so after this. He was called to Pearl Harbor to report into headquarters for a get-together, study the area, and his ship was lost at sea. He was never found. There is a man who lives at Sammamish area. He was in the newspaper last year about Veterans Day, talking about General Harmon. He was on his staff. His name is Moss, W-A-S, but he doesn't like to talk about the war. I called him up and he didn't want to discuss it. That's another subject. Continue. When I reported to Halsey's office, there was no one there but an Army officer. Oh, I have it in here. General Millard Harmon cordially greeted me and assured me that every assistance that Captain Wellings and his crew needed would be provided. I reported this information back to Captain Wellings. And General Harmon was good as his word, you shall see. So I reported back to Captain Wellings. Then I went to the hospital ward for enlisted men, and I found a seaman rich and a seaman ill. And ill was very ill. He had been badly blown up when the depth charges blew up, and he could only talk a little bit. I talked to him for a while. I just knew him casually, and I told him I would write to his parents, which I did. As I said, he couldn't talk to me because he was just so ill he couldn't carry on a conversation. The next morning, when I went back to visit, I learned that he had died during the night. I was contacted by the officer in charge to arrange burials for both of them. So I went to the chaplain's office, where the first question I was asked is, what is the religious affiliation of the deceased? I had no idea. There were no records available. And so the Protestant and Jewish chaplains both declined to officiate at their burials. Half an hour later, the problem was solved with the help of General Harmon, who found a Catholic priest willing to hold a service for these men, no matter what their religious affiliation. It was a simple graveside burial in a military cemetery near the hospital. Shortly after this priest assisted me in getting messages to their families. It was now July 8th, and this was by far my saddest duty in World War II. A few days later, I was notified that the new hospital evacuation ship Rixey, R-I-X-E-Y, would be picking me up for rapid transport to Noumea, New Caledonia, where I would board a ship back to the USA. While in Noumea, I had a great reunion with several former Strong shipmates. We located a fine French tavern that served cold American beer. Every night while we were there, we shipmates would gather for a song fest at the tavern, then march back to our quarters singing happy songs and very loud voices. It was while in Noumea that I turned in the Navy roster and payroll that I had rescued in a condom from the Strong. I gave them to the appropriate official who was set up there in Noumea. It happened to be an Army general by the name, I do not recall his name. I felt grateful and thanked him when he said, I intend that the Strong Ships Company return home intact. I might make a comment here that actually the Army General had nothing to do with it. It was Captain Wellings that made sure that the Strong Ship Company would return home intact. So that the intent of that paragraph is upside down. It was in Noumea that I received shoes and enough clothing to get me by until I could get to a military uniform store in the USA. All of my personal items and clothing went down with the ship. It took a long time before they determined how many were lost because they were scattered all over the ocean.
Right.
There were 32 some that were determined they were all gone. A month and a half later, they knew where they all had gone to, and they were no longer alive. The only clear figure that I knew was that 37 were killed from the torpedo blast because they were right at their battle stations and dead there when they were counted. So there's 37, 42, plus 46.
That's
Who
right.
knows? The trip back to the U.S. took 30 days. It was definitely a thrill to once again see the Golden Gate Bridge and its twinkling lights and the twinkling lights of San Francisco, my next favorite city after my hometown, Seattle. At 13th Naval District headquarters there, I received my orders. After a 30-day survivor's leave and a 30-day leave, I was to report to the Navy officer in charge of the USS Oak Hill, under construction at the Morris Shipbuilding Company, Oakland, California.